Christ is risen. Hello. I wanted to talk to you for a few minutes about homeschooling. Most of you, the children, are at home. Your schools are closed, and you're learning from your mother and your father, from your grandparents, from your relatives, those who are in your home, in your household. And that's a different experience for most of you. Some of you are homeschooled normally. But for the vast majority of you, homeschooling is something new. And I think it might be something you like. You get to stay in your pajamas and go to school. You get to go to school in your dining room or in your living room or in your bedroom. And that becomes your classroom. But the interesting thing is you're learning. You're still learning. You have a class with your mother or your father and or your brothers and sisters, and you're learning something new all the time. I wanted to remind you that that's the way Jesus learned. Actually, not only Jesus, but all the apostles, everybody we read about in the Bible, they were all homeschooled. Jesus didn't go to Moses grade school. He didn't go to King David high school. He learned from his mother and his father, from his grandparents, from his aunts and uncles, from his relatives, from his cousins, from his family. And he learned everything he needed to know from them. And so he was homeschooled since he was a little boy. He learned how to read. He learned how to write. He learned how to tell stories. He listened to the stories of Adam and Eve, of Moses, of Jonah, of Abraham, of King David, and Moses and the Ten Commandments. And he studied all of that, and he learned that, and he was able to apply that to his life. Those stories meant something to him. Also, the gospel tells us that his father Joseph was a carpenter and that Jesus learned that trade. So Jesus was an apprentice to his father as a carpenter. And if you think of that, if you know carpenters, if you've seen carpenters, you know they're pretty smart people. They have to figure out how to make something. They have to figure out how something works. They have to know something about arithmetic and mathematics and something about geometry. And they have to know how to join angles together and make a structure work. So Jesus learned those things, simple things, arithmetic, geometry, engineering, design. And he had a mind that allowed him to think in those terms. And a lot of his sermons, a lot of the things we read in the gospel, you can see his mind working in those ways. So he was homeschooled, and I just wanted to mention that today to each and every one of you who are being homeschooled, to be homeschooled and think of Jesus as a little boy being homeschooled by his mother and his father. Think of St. Peter and St. Paul and Mary and Elizabeth and all of the great saints of those early days were schooled at home. What does that mean? They were educated in their home. That means that they learned what they needed to know in order to live a good life. They learned it in their home from their parents. And that's the root of education. That's the first place where education begins. Every time in our church school, we always say that all we are doing is adding to and putting some other layer on top of something that's already been done at home by our mother, by our father, by our grandparents, by our relatives, by our siblings. And we're only adding a little layer on top of it with a curriculum, with something that's a little more sophisticated and designed. But that doesn't take away the basic story. The basic story is there. So when your mother and father, when you sit down and you read the story of Jonah in the whale, there's a story there. There's a great story there that carries over from just Jonah and the whale into Christ and the life of Christ. You read about Moses and the Ten Commandments. There's a deep story there, and it has something to do with what Jesus taught on the Sermon on the Mount, and so we find these links, and nobody's too young not to know or discover those things. So God bless you for being homeschooled. That's a wonderful thing. You won't be doing it all your life. Probably next September you'll all go back to school. But hopefully homeschooling continues, and your mother and your father and your brothers and your sisters and your aunts and uncles and grandparents continue to teach you and tell stories and be examples to you, as we are and as we should be all the time. God bless you, and have a wonderful day at homeschool.